December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, a dense, rolling landscape of pine and snow along the border between Belgium and Germany. For weeks, Allied commanders had believed this sector was quiet, almost peaceful. The war, they thought, was winding down. Germany was on the retreat. Victory seemed inevitable, just a matter of time. They were catastrophically wrong. In the pre-dawn darkness of that December morning, the forest erupted in a symphony of devastation. More than 200,000 German troops, supported by hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, crashed through the thinly held American lines. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture the vital port of Antwerp, had begun. The Americans would come to know it by another name, the Battle of the Bulge. The surprise was total. The shock was overwhelming. Within hours, entire units were surrounded, cut off, scattered. Communications broke down. Supply lines were severed. In the chaos and confusion, soldiers who had been enjoying what they thought was a quiet sector suddenly found themselves fighting for their very survival against overwhelming odds. Among the units thrown into this maelstrom was the 101st Airborne Division, the legendary Screaming Eagles. These were paratroopers, elite soldiers who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and had fought through Holland during Operation Market Garden. They were tough, battle-hardened, and proud. But on December 18th, when they received their orders, they were actually resting at Camp Mourmelon in France, recovering from the brutal fighting in the Netherlands. They had 48 hours to pack, load, and move. Their destination, a small Belgian crossroads town called Bastogne. Bastogne wasn't much to look at. Before the war, it had been home to about 4,000 people. It had a central square, a few cafes, some shops, and the usual collection of houses and farms you'd find in any rural Belgian town. But Bastogne had something that made it absolutely critical in December 1944: roads. 7 major roads converged on this town, making it the key to movement throughout the Ardennes. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the ability to move troops, supplies, and armor through the region. The 101st Airborne, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and various other units, arrived in Bastogne on December 19th. Their commander was Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe, a 46-year-old artillery officer from Washington, D.C. McAuliffe was not the kind of general who gave stirring speeches or sought the spotlight. He was practical, direct, and unflappable. His men respected him because he was competent, fair, and utterly unimpressed by rank or ceremony. When there was a job to be done, McAuliffe did it, no theatrics required. As the American forces consolidated their positions around Bastogne, the situation was already deteriorating rapidly. German forces were advancing from multiple directions, their panzers and infantry pushing hard to encircle the town before the defenders could establish a solid perimeter. The weather had turned bitterly cold, and heavy clouds hung low over the landscape, grounding Allied aircraft and eliminating any hope of air support or supply drops. The American soldiers dug in as best they could, but the ground was frozen solid, making foxholes a torturous endeavor. Every swing of an entrenching tool sent jarring pain through cold, numbed hands. The pine forests around Bastogne, which might have seemed picturesque in peacetime, now became a claustrophobic maze where German troops could approach unseen, where every shadow might conceal an enemy soldier, where the crack of a branch could mean the difference between life and ending up in a body bag. By December 20th, the encirclement was complete. Bastogne was surrounded. The 11,000 soldiers inside the perimeter were cut off from the rest of the American forces. No supplies were coming in, no reinforcements could reach them, and pressing in from all sides were somewhere between 40 and 50,000 German troops, supported by tanks, artillery, and the absolute conviction that they could crush this isolated American garrison and continue their drive toward Antwerp. Inside Bastogne, the situation was grim, but not yet desperate. The soldiers had some supplies, though not nearly enough. They had ammunition, though it would have to be rationed carefully. They had medical supplies, though the wounded were beginning to accumulate in improvised aid stations. What they didn't have was any clear sense of when or if relief would arrive. The radio brought fragmentary reports of the wider battle, but the information was confused and often contradictory. All anyone knew for certain was that they were alone, surrounded, and facing an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. The German artillery began its work on December 21st. The shells came in waves, screaming out of the gray sky to explode among the buildings of Bastogne or in the frozen fields where the Americans had dug in. The sound was constant, a rolling thunder that never entirely stopped, that frayed nerves and made sleep impossible, that turned every moment into an exercise in controlled fear. Between the artillery barrages came the probing attacks. German infantry would advance through the snow, testing the American lines, looking for weak points, trying to find a way to crack open the defenses. Each attack was beaten back, but each attack cost ammunition, cost medical supplies, and sometimes cost lives. The defenders began to realize they were in a battle of attrition, and the mathematics of attrition were not in their favor. The cold was an enemy almost as dangerous as the Germans. Soldiers huddled in their foxholes, trying to preserve body heat, trying to keep their weapons from freezing, trying to keep their fingers functional enough to pull a trigger if the Germans came again. Trench foot became a serious problem. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Men who had survived the fighting sometimes succumbed to the simple, merciless arithmetic of prolonged exposure to sub-freezing temperatures. Inside the town itself, the civilian population was trapped along with the soldiers. Belgian families crowded into cellars as shells exploded overhead. The wounded were brought to the few buildings that could serve as hospitals, where doctors and nurses worked by candlelight and flashlight, performing surgery without adequate supplies, making terrible decisions about who could be saved and who could not, listening to the sounds of battle that never seemed to end. On December 22nd, the sky remained overcast, the clouds low and heavy. The men in the foxholes looked up and prayed for clear weather, for the fighter-bombers and transport planes that could turn the tide of battle or at least drop desperately needed supplies. But the sky remained gray and unyielding, and the siege continued. That afternoon, at around 11:30, something unusual happened. 4 Germans appeared under a white flag, approaching the American lines from the direction of Remoifos. There were 2 officers and 2 enlisted men. One of the enlisted men carried a large white flag. The other carried a briefcase. They were met by American soldiers from F Company of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, who blindfolded them and brought them to the command post. The German officers carried an ultimatum. It was typed in English on 2 sheets of paper. The message was formal, almost polite, but its meaning was absolutely clear. The German commander, the message explained, had Bastogne completely surrounded. The American forces had fought bravely, and their resistance was acknowledged. But the situation was hopeless. Continued resistance would lead only to unnecessary suffering. The German forces had overwhelming superiority. They could, if they chose, simply annihilate the town with artillery. To avoid this unfortunate necessity, to prevent the pointless expenditure of lives, the Germans were offering the Americans an opportunity to surrender with honor. The Americans had 2 hours to consider their response. The message found its way to General McAuliffe. The general was actually sleeping when his staff woke him to present the German ultimatum. He had been up for most of the previous 48 hours, managing the defense, coordinating what limited resources he had, trying to keep 11,000 men alive against overwhelming odds. Sleep, when he could get it, was precious. McAuliffe read the German message. He thought about it for a moment, then, in what would become one of the most famous moments in American military history, he gave his response. Nuts. That was it. One word, not a paragraph of defiant rhetoric, not a carefully crafted statement of resolve. Just one word that perfectly captured McAuliffe's assessment of the German demand, his opinion of the German ultimatum, and his absolute refusal to even consider surrender. His staff members looked at each other. Was that the official response? Was the general serious? McAuliffe confirmed that, yes, that was his response. The staff officers pointed out that the Germans might not understand the colloquialism. Perhaps something more formal was needed. McAuliffe thought about it. He considered drafting something longer. Then he decided, no. Nuts was the right word. It was exactly what he meant. If the Germans didn't understand it, someone could explain it to them. The job of delivering this response fell to Colonel Joseph Harper, commander of the 327th Glider Infantry. Harper returned to where the German officers were waiting, still blindfolded. He handed them the official American response, typed on a single sheet of paper. To the German commander, nuts, the American commander. The German officers were confused. They asked Harper what nuts meant. Was it affirmative or negative? Harper didn't mince words. It means, go to hell, he told them. Then, perhaps feeling this wasn't quite clear enough, he added some additional commentary about what would happen if the Germans didn't withdraw from the area immediately. The message was delivered with the kind of directness soldiers appreciate. Clear, unambiguous, and flavored with exactly the right amount of profane emphasis to leave no doubt about American intentions. The German officers were escorted back to their lines. They carried with them a one-word response that would echo through military history. But the battle was far from over. In fact, the real test was just beginning. The Germans, insulted by the American refusal and determined to make an example of Bastogne, intensified their attacks. On December 23rd, the weather finally began to clear. For the first time in days, the clouds parted and sunlight broke through. For the besieged Americans, this was a miraculous development. Within hours, transport planes appeared overhead, dropping supplies on parachutes of red, blue, yellow, and white. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, everything the garrison desperately needed came floating down from the sky. Fighter bombers followed, swooping in to attack German positions, bombing the tanks and artillery that had been pounding Bastogne, strafing the infantry that had been probing the defenses. The psychological effect was enormous. The men in the foxholes who had felt abandoned and alone suddenly realized they weren't forgotten. The full might of the American military was coming to their aid. But the Germans weren't finished. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, they launched a massive attack from the northwest, throwing tanks and infantry against the American lines in a desperate attempt to break through before relief could arrive. The fighting was savage, close-quarters combat bed in the snow and the ruins of buildings, men grappling with each other, sometimes too close, even to use rifles, fighting with knives and entrenching tools in bare hands. The attack was beaten back, but just barely. The defenders held, though at terrible cost. The aid stations were overflowing. Ammunition was running low again despite the airdrops. Every man in the garrison, from McAuliffe down to the newest replacement, understood that they were living on borrowed time. Christmas Day, December 25th, brought a strange, surreal quality to the battle. In the morning, there was a brief lull in the fighting. Some of the soldiers tried to observe the holiday as best they could. Chaplains held services in cellars and ruined buildings. The cooks tried to prepare something that approximated a Christmas meal with the limited supplies available. Men wrote letters home, though no one knew when or if those letters would ever be delivered. McAuliffe issued a Christmas message to his troops. It was printed on mimeograph paper and distributed throughout the perimeter. The message was characteristic of the general, straightforward, honest, and touched with just enough dry humor to acknowledge the absurdity of their situation. "What's merry about all this, you ask?" the message began. "We're fighting. It's cold. We aren't home. But then it continued. We have stopped cold everything that has been thrown at us. We have identifications from 4 German panzer divisions, 2 German infantry divisions, and 1 German parachute division. These units, spearheading the last desperate German lunge, were heading straight west for key points when the 101st Airborne Division was hurriedly ordered to stem the advance. How effectively this was done will be written in history. Allied commanders have praised you. The message ended with the information that was on everyone's mind. The renowned General George Patton has sent his armor thundering north to our relief. General George S. Patton, Jr., and commanding the Third Army to the south of the Ardennes, had indeed performed a military miracle. When the Battle of the Bulge began, his army had been attacking to the east. Within 72 hours, he had disengaged from that attack, wheeled his entire army 90 degrees to the north, and sent them racing through snow and ice toward Bastogne. It was a feat of military logistics and leadership that would have been impressive under ideal conditions. That Patton accomplished it in the middle of winter through a countryside choked with refugees and retreating units, while maintaining the cohesion and fighting effectiveness of his forces, was nothing short of extraordinary. But Patton's men still had to fight their way through German forces to reach Bastogne. The relief wouldn't happen automatically. Every mile northward was contested. German troops, realizing what was happening, threw themselves into Patton's path, trying to delay the inevitable, trying to destroy the surrounded garrison before relief could arrive. Inside Bastogne, the defenders held on. They held on through more artillery barrages. They held on through more infantry attacks. They held on through the cold and the exhaustion and the mounting casualties. They held on because surrender was not an option, because McAuliffe had said, "Nuts," because 11,000 soldiers had decided collectively that they would rather fight against overwhelming odds than submit to the enemy. On December 26th, in the late afternoon, the sound of battle to the south intensified. American artillery fire, heavier and more sustained than anything the garrison had been able to produce, began pounding German positions. The soldiers in the foxholes looked at each other, hardly daring to hope. Could this be it? Could this be Patton? At approximately 4:50 p.m., a column of Sherman tanks from the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, broke through the German lines and rolled into Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The garrison had held. Against all odds, through everything the Wehrmacht could throw at them, the defenders of Bastogne had refused to break. The relief didn't end the Battle of the Bulge. Fighting would continue in the Ardennes for several more weeks. The 101st Airborne and the other units that had defended Bastogne would remain engaged, pushing back against German counterattacks, helping to eliminate the bulge in the American lines. The battle would claim tens of thousands of casualties on both sides before it finally ended in late January 1945. But Bastogne had been the turning point. The stubborn defense of this small Belgian crossroads town had disrupted the German timetable. It had forced the Wehrmacht to commit resources and time to reducing the pocket. It had bought the Allies the precious days they needed to bring up reinforcements, to stabilize the front, to begin the counteroffensive that would ultimately drive the Germans back to their starting positions and beyond. And at the center of the Bastogne story was that one word, nuts. McAuliffe's response became legendary almost immediately. Soldiers loved it because it was exactly the kind of thing a soldier would say, not some polished, sanitized version of defiance, but the genuine article, straight from the gut. It was disrespectful, dismissive, and absolutely perfect. It captured in a single syllable everything the defenders felt about the German ultimatum and about the Germans' chances of forcing them to surrender. The press loved it too, though for slightly different reasons. In an era when military communications tended toward the formal and bureaucratic, nuts was refreshingly human. It made McAuliffe instantly relatable. Here was a general who talked like a regular person, who could reduce a complex military situation to a single, profane colloquialism, who clearly possessed both a sense of humor and an iron backbone. The story spread rapidly. Newspapers across America printed it. Radio broadcasts featured it. It appeared in newsreels. Nuts became shorthand for American determination, for the refusal to quit even when the odds seemed impossible, for the kind of defiant spirit that the American public wanted to believe characterized their fighting men. For the soldiers who were there, who had lived through the siege, nuts became a point of pride. They had been part of something historic. They had held against overwhelming odds. And their commander, when offered the chance to surrender, had responded in a way that perfectly expressed their collective determination. In the years that followed, veterans of Bastogne would gather for reunions. They would tell their stories. And inevitably, someone would mention nuts. And everyone would nod, remembering that moment when one word crystallized everything they had endured and everything they had accomplished. General McAuliffe himself was somewhat bemused by the fame that came from his one-word response. He had simply said what seemed appropriate at the moment. He hadn't been trying to create a memorable quotation or secure his place in history. He had been a tired officer responding to an enemy ultimatum in language that seemed fitting. The fact that this response became famous, that it was quoted and celebrated and remembered, was not something he had anticipated or particularly sought. In the decades after the war, historians and military analysts studied the Battle of the Bulge exhaustively. They examined the German planning, the Allied response, the tactical decisions, the strategic implications. Bastogne featured prominently in these analyses. The defense of the town was recognized as a pivotal moment, a place where individual courage and collective determination had direct strategic consequences. But for all the detailed military analysis, for all the discussions of logistics and tactics and strategic objectives, what ordinary people remembered was nuts. It became one of those moments that transcended military history to enter popular culture. People who couldn't tell you anything else about the Battle of the Bulge knew about McAuliffe's response. It was taught in schools. It appeared in movies and books. It became part of the American narrative about World War II. There is something deeply appealing about the story. Part of it is the underdog nature of the situation. 11,000 soldiers surrounded by a vastly superior force, cut off, outnumbered, facing the prospect of annihilation. Part of it is the character of McAuliffe himself, the no-nonsense officer who cut through military formality to deliver a response that was as honest as it was defiant. And part of it is simply the word itself, nuts. It's funny and serious at the same time. It's disrespectful without being crude. It's the kind of thing that makes you smile while simultaneously recognizing the steel behind it. The German commanders, for their part, apparently never quite understood why the Americans made such a fuss over this word. To them, it seemed like a strange thing to celebrate. But then, the Germans had fundamentally misunderstood the American position from the beginning. They had assumed that a surrounded, outnumbered garrison would see surrender as the rational choice. They had offered what they considered generous terms. They had genuinely expected the Americans to accept. They hadn't accounted for the stubbornness of the American soldier. They hadn't factored in the pride of the 101st Airborne, a division that had never surrendered, never retreated, never failed to accomplish its mission. They hadn't understood that sometimes the rational choice isn't the one that gets made, that sometimes men decide to fight against overwhelming odds not because they expect to win, but because surrender is simply unacceptable. Bastogne taught the Germans that lesson, and nuts became the verbal embodiment of that lesson. In the years since World War II, nuts has taken on a life beyond the original context. It's been referenced in countless military situations. Officers facing difficult decisions, soldiers dealing with impossible odds, units that refuse to quit, all have invoked nuts as a kind of shorthand for determination. It's become part of the language of military resilience. The word has also been analyzed and discussed. Some have suggested that McAuliffe's actual response might have been more colorful, more explicitly profane, and that nuts was a sanitized version for public consumption. Others have argued that nuts was exactly what he said, that it perfectly captured his personality and his style of leadership. The truth is probably that we'll never know with absolute certainty exactly what words passed through McAuliffe's mind in that moment. But what matters is what was written down, what was delivered to the Germans, what became part of the historical record. The legacy of Bastogne extends beyond nuts, of course. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of American air power once the weather cleared. It showed the flexibility and resilience of American logistics, particularly Patton's remarkable redeployment of the Third Army. It revealed the courage and endurance of American soldiers at every level, from generals to privates. It became a defining moment of the war, a place where the outcome genuinely hung in balance and where the determination of relatively small numbers of men had strategic consequences. But if you ask people what they remember about Bastogne, most will say nuts. It's the detail that sticks. It's the human moment in the midst of vast historical forces. It's the general who responded to a formal ultimatum with a single, dismissive word. It's the refusal that became a rallying cry. Today, if you visit Bastogne, you'll find a town that remembers. There is a museum dedicated to the battle. There are monuments to the units that fought there. The surrounding forests and fields, now peaceful, still bear traces of the fighting, if you know where to look. And everywhere you'll see references to December 1944, to the siege, to the American soldiers who held the line. The Mardassin Memorial, a massive star-shaped structure on a hill outside the town, lists the names of American units that participated in the Battle of the Bulge. Standing there, looking out over the landscape where so much history unfolded, you can almost hear the echo of artillery, almost feel the bitter cold of that December, almost sense the determination of the soldiers who refused to surrender. McAuliffe himself went on to have a distinguished military career after the war. He eventually rose to the rank of four-star general. He held various commands, contributed to military planning and policy, served his country with distinction for many more years. But he would always be remembered primarily for one thing, that one-word response on December 22, 1944. In his later years, McAuliffe gave occasional interviews about Bastogne. He was always somewhat modest about his role. Yes, he had said nuts. Yes, it seemed to have resonated with people, but he insisted that the real story was not about one word or one general, but about 11,000 soldiers who had done their duty under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The glory, he said, belonged to them. He was right, of course. Bastogne was a collective achievement. Every soldier who held a position on the perimeter, every medic who treated wounded under fire, every driver who brought ammunition forward through artillery barrages, every officer who kept his unit functioning under impossible stress. They all contributed to the defense of the town. Nuts may have been McAuliffe's word, but the sentiment belonged to everyone who fought there. And yet the word endures. It endures because it captured something essential. In the darkest days of the Battle of the Bulge, when German panzers were rolling through the Ardennes, when Allied lines were crumbling, when the outcome of the entire campaign seemed uncertain, a surrounded American garrison responded to a demand for surrender with a single defiant word. That word said, "We will not quit." That word said, "You will have to defeat us on the battlefield because we will never voluntarily give up." That word said, "We are Americans, and we do not surrender." The siege of Bastogne lasted 8 days. 8 days of artillery fire, infantry attacks, bitter cold, dwindling supplies, mounting casualties, and constant pressure. 8 days of men pushing themselves beyond what they thought were their limits. 8 days of a garrison that refused to break. And it all pivoted on that moment when McAuliffe read the German ultimatum, considered the impossible situation he and his men faced, and responded with a word that would echo through history: nuts. It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't poetic, it wasn't the kind of statement that military academies typically study, but it was perfect, it was honest, it was unmistakably American. And it became, in that moment and forever after, a battle cry. A one-word declaration that some positions are worth defending, that some causes are worth fighting for, that surrender is not always an option, and that sometimes the right response to impossible odds is simply nuts. The soldiers in the foxholes around Bastogne, cold and hungry and scared, heard about McAuliffe's response. They heard that their general had told the Germans to go to hell. They heard that there would be no surrender, no compromise, no giving up. And they fought on. They fought through December 23rd, through Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, through one more day of desperate combat until the tanks of the 4th Armored Division broke through on December 26th. They fought because they were well-trained and disciplined. They fought because they believed in their cause. They fought because they had faith in their leaders and trust in each other. But perhaps just a little bit, they also fought because their general had said nuts, and that word had reminded them of who they were and what they were capable of enduring. In the grand sweep of World War II, Bastogne was one battle among many. The war would continue for another 5 months in Europe. There would be more fighting, more casualties, more tests of courage and endurance. But Bastogne held a special place. It was where American forces, surrounded and outnumbered, demonstrated that determination could overcome material disadvantage, that spirit could triumph over circumstances, that 11,000 soldiers could defy an army. And it gave us nuts, a word that means both nothing and everything, that is simultaneously dismissive and defiant, humorous and deadly serious, simple and profound. It's a word that belongs to a specific moment in history, but has transcended that moment to become part of our collective memory. It's a word that still resonates today, more than 80 years after it was first spoken, because nuts isn't really about one word or one battle. It's about the spirit behind the word. It's about the refusal to accept defeat. It's about looking at impossible odds and deciding to fight anyway. It's about the moment when someone says, "You cannot win," and you respond, "Watch me try." That's the legacy of Bastogne. That's why we remember. That's why, when we think about the siege of that small Belgian town in December 1944, we think about cold and courage, about soldiers and sacrifice, about a desperate defense and a miraculous relief. And we think about a general who, when offered the chance to surrender, simply said, "Nuts." It was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly right. The story of how one word became a battle cry and broke the siege of Bastogne is ultimately a story about human determination. It's about what people can accomplish when they refuse to quit. It's about leadership that trusts soldiers enough to tell them the truth. About soldiers who trust leadership enough to follow orders, even when those orders mean staying in an impossible situation. It's about the conviction that some things matter more than personal safety, that some positions are worth defending regardless of the cost. Bastogne is quiet now. The fields are peaceful. The forests have grown back. The people live their lives much as people do everywhere, worrying about ordinary things, dealing with everyday challenges. But the memory remains. The town remembers what happened there. Belgium remembers. America remembers. We remember the siege. We remember the soldiers who fought there. We remember the general who refused to surrender. And we remember the word, nuts. Short, sharp, dismissive, defiant, perfect. A word that became a battle cry. A word that helped break a siege. A word that reminds us even now that determination matters, that courage counts, that the human spirit, when properly motivated and led, can accomplish extraordinary things. That is the story of Bastogne. That is the legacy of nuts. And that is why, more than 8 decades after the event, we still tell this tale, because it reminds us of who we can be when circumstances demand our best, when the easy choice is surrender, and we choose instead to fight, when someone offers us a way out and we respond absolutely not, never, nuts.